Good, good morning and welcome to Inquirer Worldview. My name is Erica Palan and I'm the Inquirer's Deputy Opinion Editor. Today, we'll be talking to award-winning foreign affairs columnist Trudy Rubin, who is just back from 2 weeks in Ukraine and Lithuania. As we speak, the situation between Ukraine and Russia is evolving rapidly. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that 137 Ukrainian soldiers and civilians have been killed so far. Russian troops have entered the capital city of Kyiv, where fighting has intensified. Trudy and I will talk today about how we got here and what this means for America and for the world. I encourage you to submit questions for Trudy throughout this discussion by using the comment section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching from social media, head over to inquirer.com/live to submit your questions. Now, let's jump right into it. Trudy, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Glad to be here.
So, because the situation is changing so quickly, can you start by telling us the latest? Where are we now?
Where we are now is that predictions are that Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, could fall over the weekend. Russians have taken a military airport just outside the city, Antonov Airport. They have landed paratroopers, and they're expected to bring in 10,000 special troops who will try to go into Kiev and, in the words of the Russians, decapitate the Nazis and impose denazification. And since they define the elected government of Ukraine as Nazis, that means take out the government, whether by arrest or even by killing top officials like President Zelensky. There have been explosions in Kiev, but now everyone is waiting for the troops to march in. The Russians are also advancing in the south. They're trying to link Crimea up by land with Russia. Right now, Crimea is only linked by a bridge to Russia. You'll remember Russia took Crimea in the previous invasion in 2014. So as the world watches, President Zelensky says he isn't leaving, but many Ukrainians are. The roads are jam-packed outside of Kiev, but gas supplies are running out, food is running out, and it is a very grim situation with people in the country just waiting for the unknown to reveal itself in the person of Vladimir Putin, who is behaving like a war criminal.
Grim indeed. Just this morning, reports surfaced that Russia says they're willing to negotiate, but what does that mean?
What it means in Putin's terms is capitulation. He has used negotiations for a smokescreen for weeks. It's clear that this invasion was planned some time ago, and yet he was fooling the West by holding out the promise of negotiations, first with the United States, then with President Macron, who mistakenly believed that Putin had said he would de-escalate, so Putin made a fool of Macron. German Chancellor, the new Chancellor Scholz, also went to Moscow, and the same thing, although he didn't act the fool the way Macron did. So all of this talk about negotiations is simply language meaning, if you want to surrender, stand down, let us put a puppet in charge and arrest you, we will stop. So far, President Zelensky is holding on.
So I know it's been about 2 weeks since you returned from Ukraine. And you mentioned, just a few minutes ago, how many Ukrainians are fleeing, particularly the capital city of Kyiv. But what are you hearing from your contacts in Ukraine who have decided to stay? There are some people in Kyiv who've decided to stay and fight. Can you talk about the mood on the ground now that Russian troops have invaded?
The mood on the ground, I think, mostly is uncertain, confused, astonished, and horrified. I should add that President Zelensky actually asked Putin for negotiations, but he meant serious talks, not the kind that Moscow has made clear is all he will get. I have talked to several people who tried to get out of the city, but at this point, it's almost impossible because the roads are so clogged. Furthermore, Zelensky has made a decree that all men between, I think it is 16 and 60, have to stay in the city in case they're called up. I have talked to people who have been training with the Territorial Guard and they want to fight. There is a real sense of patriotism, but not everybody has the courage to do it, at least at this point. But most of those volunteers are not yet armed. They may have hunting rifles at home, but as I found out in Kiev, many of them have been training with cardboard rifles. However, the government has announced that it's giving out 18,000 semi-automatics all over the country, and men are lining up to get them in order to fight back. Unfortunately, probably some people who shouldn't have them, but mostly patriots who want to fight back. So I've talked to people like that, but I have also talked to people who are really quite frightened. For example, newspaper journalists. They're reportedly, and reported by U.S. intelligence, which has been right on the money so far, there are reportedly lists that have been made up by Moscow. And Moscow troops or intelligence service people will try to arrest these people. If there is resistance, whether it's by journalists or by activists, the word is out that such people will be arrested, may be held in camps, maybe in prison. So I've talked to some journalists that are now terrified about putting their bylines on articles because they're young people and they see their future or their lives going up in smoke. Others who are defiantly still willing to put their names on lists. And other people who are just trying to find a basement where they can hide so that they don't have to go down into a subway tunnel like Londoners did during the Blitz.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. We had an op-ed just this morning from a chef in Kyiv whose restaurant happens to be in a basement. So he's opened it up as a bomb shelter to anyone who needs a place to be. So I know you've been immersed in Ukraine for months now, and you've written many columns about how we got here. But for our viewers today, I want to take a big step back so we can understand the basics of what's happening. So I want to start with sort of a question that is both simple and complicated. What does Putin want out of all of this?
Well, it's a question that a lot of people have thought they had the answer to. I thought I had a partial answer and have been proven wrong. I once asked a question that became famous at the Davos World Economic Forum, who is Mr. Putin, in 2000? And four Soviet high-ranking officials on the stage refused to answer. And the clip played over and over again, who is Mr. Putin? I thought it had become clear that Mr. Putin is simply a KGB colonel. That's his life experience in the Soviet Union, and would behave like such. But it turns out that Mr. Putin isn't the kind of rational, cold-blooded, clear-eyed person one associates with an intelligence operative. He seems to be driven at this point by deep anger and frustration at the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he has labeled the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And he seems determined to recreate the Soviet Union only in terms of Russia, calling it Russia. It's the imperial space now of Russia. So while he is willing to use the tactics of a KGB operative, he seems driven by this emotional need to incorporate Ukraine back into Russia and historic Russia in an effort to make Russia great again. He has written long pieces saying that Ukraine has no right to be a separate country, that the Ukrainian people are the same as Russians, despite the fact that he's bombing them, and that Ukraine was artificially created and should now be absorbed back into its rightful home. He also sees any country like Ukraine that wants to look to the West, not just to join NATO, which I think is a red herring, but to join perhaps the European Union. He sees this as a threat, not because NATO is ever going to move missiles into, or was ever going to move missiles into Ukraine, which NATO has offered to negotiate with Putin any Western placement of missiles in Europe, if he will negotiate the same about Russian missiles that are right up next to Western European countries. But he's turned down such negotiations. So what he wants is to prevent Ukraine from becoming close to the West, because he believes that's a threat to his hold on power.
I'm curious why now, though. Obviously, there were the major uprisings in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. We're 7, 8 years since then. Why now?
When Putin invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014, I was in Ukraine, and he thought that he would be welcomed by Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and most Ukrainians speak Russian. He wasn't. So he was able to move into the east, the part that borders Russia, but basically was stopped, and that surprised him. He thought he could go all the way across the south to Odessa. I think that the last 2 years with COVID has changed his mentality. I think he had hoped by negotiations to get President Zelensky, who he didn't take seriously, to agree that Ukraine would be neutral, and neutral to Putin meant basically that he would control the country. And Zelensky didn't agree. Zelensky was willing to negotiate over the territory that Russia occupied in the east, but he wasn't willing to agree to Putin's terms. And so I think Putin decided negotiations would not work. And he reached this point where he saw NATO wouldn't use force. And add to that the fact that he has been living in a bunker because of COVID. He is paranoid about COVID. He is out of touch with anyone except his small circle. And he has gotten nervous about unrest in Russia and has cracked down totally on any dissent, including on the leader he poisoned, Navalny, who survived but is in jail. I think he decided the moment had come, and his paranoia was exacerbated by being in this bunker and cut off. And he decided that he actually could take on Europe as a whole and nothing would happen. And he saw that Germany was uncertain with new leadership. He saw divisions in Europe, Britain pulling out of Europe because of Brexit. And he decided the moment was weak, and also his ties with China have become closer in the last year. I think he also decided that China would not oppose this, and so it was time to move.
We're going to come back to China in just a little bit. But for now, you mentioned the instability of Germany and the United Kingdom. So I'm going to ask our producers to pull up a map that shows Ukraine and the surrounding nations. And I hope that what you can do here is help our viewers understand, why is this crisis about more than just Ukraine? Why do other nations in Europe need to be concerned about this?
Other nations need to be concerned for several reasons. First of all, they need to be concerned because there is a leader in Russia who has broken all the norms of post-World War II Europe, which revolved around force not being used to take over another country. That's what Hitler did in the 30s. That's what caused World War II. And Europeans thought that era was over forever. So now they see there is not only a leader in Moscow who is willing to use force to take over non-NATO countries, so far non-NATO countries, but he is willing to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. I can get back to that later, but it's a point that has to be emphasized, because Putin has said publicly this week that anyone who opposes, any country who opposes his takeover of Ukraine, let me read the quote, Whoever tries to interfere with our actions should know that the Russian response will be immediate and will lead to the kind of consequences you have never experienced in your entire history. We are ready for any scenario. That is a threat that should send chills. So what happens if Moscow takes over Ukraine? If you look at that map, Russia, while everyone was focused on Ukraine, Putin has taken over Belarus, the country right above Ukraine, which also used to be part of the Soviet Union. There is a dictator there who is now in Putin's pocket because his people protested a rigged election in which his opponent probably won in 2020. And there were massive demonstrations, and he could only put them down with Putin's backing. So Mr. Lukashenko, this dictator, owes everything to Moscow. Therefore, Putin had 30,000 troops in Belarus exercising. They are now backing up Belarus is backing up those 30,000 who are now marching into Ukraine. And so if you look at the map, Belarus is right up against Lithuania, which is a Baltic state, which is a member of NATO. If Ukraine is taken over by Putin, Ukraine is up against Poland, a member of NATO. And Belarus is against Poland. There is only a 60-mile gap. If you look on the map, it says Suwalki Gap. That is the only territorial link between the three Baltic states who were members of NATO and the West, i.e. Poland, another NATO member. That could be cut off. Putin has made clear in the past that he thinks those three independent Baltic states should not have been allowed to go independent. He has intervened with cyber and on sea, and clearly would like to try to make life difficult for those states. And if he could, install pro-Russian puppet regimes. NATO has Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. So you now have vulnerable states who are NATO members in Europe. And you have Putin in a bunker who has indicated that he is willing to use force and to threaten nuclear force, whether or not he would use it, to recreate the old Soviet Union, which he now views as the rightful Russian Empire. He doesn't use the word, he denies the word as empire, but what else can you call it? He says Kiev is the heart of the old Russian Empire. This is imperialism of 19th century style. And he is styling himself a czar who has a right to expand Russian territory. And therefore, all of Europe has to be nervous. And the United States, which is a member of NATO, has to be nervous because such a reckless leader who will be right up against NATO members, possibly putting nuclear weapons near them, is a threat to all of Europe, to America's closest allies, and in his recklessness to the wider world.
Thanks, Trudy, and thanks, Angelica, for the map. You started to get into this in your last answer of why Americans need to care about this, but I think, something that would be helpful for our listeners to hear from you is, why should the everyday American care about this? Not, folks who work in government, folks who work in the White House and with diplomacy. Why does the person watching this in Philadelphia need to care?
Well, I think anyone who has read some American history or studied some world history in high school, if such courses are still given, remembers that in the 1930s, many Americans thought, why should we worry about Europe? Why should we worry if Hitler takes Poland or Czechoslovakia? Why does it affect us if Hitler is bombing London? The fact is that we are connected with Europe by virtue of our values and our systems. This is the heart of the democratic world. And if you just want to hypothesize, if Putin could demonstrate that a leader who is willing to use brute force and invade neighbors who are close in values or even in alliance to the United States, and nothing happens. And Putin is now closely aligned in a marriage of convenience with China. Then you have a situation in which the autocrats of the world, who are willing to take what they want and not play by the rules, not solve problems by diplomacy, are going to be setting the rules of the world. They're going to be controlling trade routes. They're going to be threatening other democracies. They're ultimately going to be threatening the United States, whether it's our ships, our trade, our people abroad. The United States cannot lead in a vacuum. It cannot live in a vacuum. We're interconnected with the world. And if you have dictators with nuclear weapons who see no holds barred in how they act outside their borders, eventually they are going to attack US interests, and we cannot stay isolated and removed.
Thank you for that. I want to take a step back from the urgency of this week's news for a minute. And before I do that, let's remind all of our listeners at home that you can submit questions at inquirer.com/live. And at the end of this presentation, we'll go through as many reader questions as we have time for. But Trudy, thinking about your trip to Ukraine, I know you've been back for about 2 weeks now. Can you talk about what you were looking for when you went there? Let's focus on Kyiv to start. What were you looking for in the capital city?
What I was looking for was to see how Ukrainians were reacting to the threats that were then coming from Moscow, whether there was a patriotic surge, whether people were preparing for a possible invasion. And that was in Kiev. And I also went down to the southeast, to the port cities of Mariupol and Berdyansk, which were close to the front from the previous invasion by Russia. We've already forgotten that this whole invasion now started when Putin claimed he wanted to recognize the, quote, independence of the areas that pro-Russian, Russian-backed puppets had already taken control of. So I went down right near those areas to see how people were thinking, reacting, and what they were seeing.
Talk a bit more about your visit to Mariupol. One of the most gripping columns you wrote while you were there was while you were on a Ukrainian ship in the freezing cold with their Coast Guard. What was that experience like?
I think what I saw there was how outgunned the Ukrainians were, despite the bravery of the people in their military forces. This particular ship was captained by a man who had been commanding a ship based in Crimea, a ship in the Ukrainian Navy, when Russian troops poured into Crimea, and he had to take his ship out to sea and leave his family behind because he was in the Navy and he was trying to save his ship. The family ultimately got out, but what he told me was that Russian warships were already offshore. This is the Sea of Azov, which is an extension of the Black Sea. And there were already ships outside his port, outside the neighboring larger port of the city of Mariupol. And in the Black Sea, large troop transport, amphibious warships were coming into the Black Sea. They are now firing at Ukraine's largest port, Odessa. And this port where I went on the Coast Guard cutter is basically sealed off by the Russians now.
One of the things that really stunned me about your reporting from Ukraine was that Ukrainians seemed so calm. They told you directly, we are not leaving. And for me, sitting at home in Philadelphia, watching CNN and hearing the White House at the time insisting that invasion was coming, I felt like there was this cognitive dissonance from what I was hearing from you on the ground and what American media was telling me. Why do you think that Ukrainians were so calm?
I think for two reasons. First, the war in Ukraine had been going on for 8 years. It had been going on in the East. These Russian proxies, basically Ukrainians who were sent by Russian intelligence from Moscow and who amassed gangs of ne'er-do-wells, unhappy young people, lawless people, and terrified the people in those regions. Basically, the war was down there, and almost 15,000 people had died. But for people in Kiev, even for people in Mariupol, which was right next to that first war zone, but had fought back the Russians when they tried to, the pro-Russians, when they tried to take Mariupol in 2014, nobody really believed it was going to happen. They thought that maybe Putin would try to take more territory in the East, adjacent to what the pro-Russians already controlled. They thought maybe he would recognize the independence, as he did, of the fake independence of those areas. But they never expected, they simply did not believe that Russian troops in 2022 would be invading Ukraine, their neighbor, a population that is close ethnically to Russians, as if it was Hitler going into Poland in 1939. And it is true that President Zelensky kept telling people to keep calm and was telling the Americans not to talk in such warlike language. The problem was that the Americans were getting absolutely correct intelligence, as we have seen. It's a tribute to our intelligence community. And Biden had a different aim. He wanted to put out there the truth of what was happening so that in Moscow they couldn't spew disinformation that kept denying that these exercises all around Ukraine were actually a preparation for war. Zelensky had another purpose, keeping his people from panicking. But my guess is that even Zelensky never expected this, because before he became a politician, he was a famous TV comic, an actor, and he performed all across Russia. He was very popular. Most Ukrainians also speak Russian. I don't think even Zelensky, and certainly not most of the people that I spoke with when I was in Kiev, they just didn't believe Putin would do it.
It's terrifying to think about. So, one last question about your trip and your columns that you wrote while you were there. The one thing that has stuck with me, I mean, it's haunted me, is the story of civilians training for war, just outside Kyiv using cardboard guns. And, you shared photos like the one that's on the screen right now that are just haunting to look at. And I wonder, all of these civilians, graphic designers, marketing people, health insurance agents, everyday civilians, do you think that they're well prepared for war now that an invasion has begun?
I don't think they are well prepared in the sense that the government didn't do a good job of advanced preparation. Again, I think because they underestimated and didn't want to cause panic. So people didn't know where there were shelters. The people in the units that I went to watch train wanted guns already, but the guns that they were supposed to get were still in storage in a facility up near the Belarus border, which the Russians, have just come across. So now people are going out with hunting rifles, and the government has just announced, as I mentioned, they're distributing 18,000 semi-automatics all around the country. And there are huge lines for these guns, many of them veterans who fought against Russia in the past 8 years on the front line. So the population isn't prepared. The territorial defense, which is these volunteer units, was only called up 48 hours ago. However, I believe if the Russians try to occupy Kiev in the long run, you're going to have a bloody resistance because Ukrainians do not want a puppet regime. They will not support it. And that raises the question of how violent is the suppression of a rebellion going to be? And if there is peaceful resistance, which I think people will try to do in the tens of thousands out on the streets, will they be mowed down and arrested the way Putin just arrested 1,700 people out of a crowd that was demonstrating in Moscow against this war, and said they will all be labeled and tried as traitors?
Scary to think about. So let's bring us back to this week. On Monday, Putin gave a speech that I think most folks have probably heard about by now, where he recognized the so-called independence of parts of eastern Ukraine. And I'm going to ask our producer to bring a map up again, a different map, so that we can look at where those regions are. But Trudy, how can you explain to us, how did recognizing that so-called independence set the stage for where we are today with troops in Kyiv?
I think this was another cover story because while all the attention was on the east, the troops were massing in the north in Belarus, and the ships were forming in formation in the south off of Odessa, and troops were also coming from Russia towards into Ukraine. So that independence was a feint, F-E-I-N-T. It's not that it doesn't give Russia a further foothold with troops in that region. And some of those troops may take the city of Mariupol. That's the port where I was. You can see it to the right. And they may move to create a land bridge with Crimea. But right now, I think that Putin is aiming at taking over the whole country. So the action that matters right now is Kiev and the planned overthrow of the government, and how this Russian Hitler believes he can actually hold a capital city of millions when the population is totally opposed to such an occupation.
Thanks. And I think we're good with the map now. So this week has just been a major turning point in global affairs. Yesterday, President Biden, for the second time this week, announced increased sanctions against Russia. On Tuesday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halted certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Is there any chance that these kinds of diplomatic moves are enough to deter Putin? And what do you expect will happen if they can't deter Putin?
I don't think these moves are enough. I wish more had been done. I think, as I was told by officials in Lithuania when I was there just recently after I was in Ukraine, Putin understands force or prevention, deterrence. Now, these sanctions will have an impact in the long run. I do think that Putin has factored in the pain. Russia has an enormous hard currency reserve fund in their central bank of around 650 billion. So he can subsidize a lot of the pain. And most economic analysts believe that the only thing that would really catch his attention is if we treated Russia as Iran and basically sanctioned sales of oil and gas, as well as the Russian central bank. We have sanctioned major banks in Russia, so they can't move currency outside. Russia cannot, refinance its debt. We've sanctioned some of the oligarchs around Putin, although the ones closest to him were already sanctioned. We could do more in that regard. But really, I think we did not activate cutting Russia off from the SWIFT financial transaction network that covers all transactions with most banks around the world. President Biden claimed that our sanctions on major Russian banks do the same thing. But I think that SWIFT, the word, has taken on such a global connotation that despite the opposition to activating SWIFT by some European countries, we should have gone for it because it gives the global impression that we and European countries are serious. And I think it brings us back to something that we have some questions about, which is the military question. Biden has said NATO will not send troops, and this is understandable because Ukraine isn't a NATO country, but the Ukrainians want to fight themselves. It's not like the Afghan situation with the military collapse. This army is fighting bravely to the death. You may have seen a story about an island off of Odessa called Snake Island. There were 13 Coast Guard people on that island defending it, and it's a crucial strategic territory, only 13 young men. And when Russian ships said surrender, they shouted over the loudspeaker, Russia F you, and they were pounded to death. This is the kind of resistance, and I do believe that it is imperative to get more weapons, defensive weapons into Ukraine, weapons that can shoot down planes, that can attack helicopters, that can fight back, because the Ukrainians do not have the ability to fend off the Russian Air Force. So, yes, these sanctions matter, but they're for the long run. And I think it's imperative to help the Ukrainians in the short run.
So before we turn this over to audience questions, and a reminder to folks at home that you can submit questions at inquirer.com/live. We have a lot coming in, so I'm just going to ask one more question before we turn to what our viewers are curious about. And the question I have is sort of the existential one of all of this, that how did we get here? And by that, I think I specifically mean, how is it possible in 2022 that Russia can invade and occupy a peaceful neighboring country? This feels like it goes against the assumption that we've had since World War II that no country in Europe could take over another country by force. It feels, surreal and unbelievable. Can you speak to how did this happen?
I think I've spoken a little bit about Vladimir Putin's resentment, anger, and bitterness that about the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, which tracks basically with the Russian Empire. A lot of people say that's because NATO expanded eastward, but I think his resentments go far beyond that. And if, for example, the Baltic states were not part of NATO, I think he'd be trying to take them over too. So you had Putin's resentments festering. You had China becoming ever stronger. And I think both Putin and Xi Jinping have concluded that the West is on the way down, and that now is the moment, delayed for a couple of years by COVID, that now is the moment to act. Now, the Chinese not yet, and we can talk more about that, but they are not actively opposing what Russia is doing, and Russia knows they won't, which is important. So you have a situation where Vladimir Putin for years has been acting like a war criminal, and people, governments, just didn't comprehend how far beyond the rules of normal international behavior he was willing to go. And looking back, I do think people will ask why. I mean, after all, this is a leader who poisoned his opposition in England with chemical weapons, who poisoned Alexei Navalny, who had to be gotten out to Germany to survive, and now has locked him away in the Gulag. This is a leader who gave weapons to his proxies in eastern Ukraine that they used to shoot down a commercial aircraft in 2014, in which almost 300 civilians, most of them Dutch, were killed. And Putin still denies it. Putin denies every stage of the game. This is a leader who used Russian airplanes to slaughter Syrian civilians for years, bombing hospitals, schools, and markets, and got away with it. This in order to keep his ally Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. So people didn't see the danger signs. And then in 2014, Putin invaded a neighboring country and took over parts of its territory in Crimea, which he denied at first with little green men, Russians out of uniform, and then in eastern Ukraine, which he got away with, and still everyone in the West wanted to negotiate. But there's one critical final point, and I'll make it underlined because it's so important. Putin looked at the United States and Europe and saw divisions and internal weaknesses that he thought would prevent any reaction to what he did. In Germany, the only defensive weapons they sent to Ukraine were 5,000 helmets. And it is true that Chancellor Scholz, after the invasion started this week, finally, I don't know what you call it, not permanently canceled, but put a lid on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia directly to Germany. But that pipeline was never economic, as the Germans claimed. That was a political cudgel that Russia was using over Western Europe and Ukraine, and Germany refused to see it. And then there's the United States. Putin looks at the political divisions inside the United States as a sign that the US will never respond seriously to anything he does. And instead of uniting GOP and Democrats and the whole country in recognition that Putin is now threatening us in the world, instead you have divisions where former President Trump actually praised Putin's brilliance in his tactics over the weekend, and where many of the GOP, not all, a lot of GOP senators are firm in their criticism, but many in the GOP are more interested in attacking President Biden than they are in joining together in a unified expression of support for Ukraine and figuring out how to do more. And this is tragic because this is a moment like Hitler's invasion of Germany. Of Poland. I don't think that Putin will threaten the United States tomorrow. I don't think that he is ready to use nuclear weapons against the United States in the foreseeable. But I do think this is a man who is willing to move nuclear warheads up next to NATO countries like Poland and the Baltics after he takes over all this new territory. And if he isn't recognized now as a war criminal, who knows what will happen in the next year or two.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Trump's comments and the divisiveness between the GOP and the Democrats in America and how that ties into this. You know, I'd encourage listeners and viewers who are interested in reading more opinion about that to look at the editorial that the Inquirer editorial board posted about the need for American unity at this time. And with that note, I'm going to turn this over to some audience questions that we've gotten in. And I'm going to start with some questions about China because we have a lot. So I'm going to start with a question from a viewer named Jeffrey Selling. Or I'm sorry, we will get to Jeffrey's question. I'm so sorry, that one's not on China, but we'll get to that next. We're going to start with a question from a viewer named Michael Buden, who wants to know, where does China stand in all of this? And have they committed to support Russia financially in the event of US sanctions?
China is trying to play it both ways. China has a famous mantra that it stands for non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. Nothing could have crossed and attacked that mantra more clearly than Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But the Chinese on the Security Council have been very brief, their ambassador, and unwilling to attack the invasion by name. And what officials have done in Beijing is blame the United States for the invasion, saying that the US and NATO forced Putin into action by arming Ukraine, which is a joke, and by promising them NATO membership, which they didn't. So China is not going to abandon Russia. And that is a very important point, even though they are now China is now calling for negotiations. But of course, as I said, for Putin, negotiations are capitulation. Maybe that will happen in the end if Ukraine is broken, but it's not negotiations, it's surrender. As for sanctions, yes, I think China will help. If there would be sanctions on the sale of Russian gas and oil, I think China would try to find workarounds. If SWIFT would be enacted, in other words, cutting Russia off from being able to do dollar transactions, I think that China would find a way for a workaround to pay Russia in their currency and do swaps. So yes, I think they will help. I don't think they can offset the full impact. But it is clear that China will not stand against Russia. I think the most interesting sign will be if there is a vote in the Security Council to sanction Russia, whether China abstains or vetoes. And then their position will be out in the open.
Another question from our readers, from Frank Quattrone, who wonders if it's likely that, given how on edge the world is right now because of Putin's aggression against Ukraine, do you think that Xi Jinping will finally make his move on Taiwan during this time?
I think Xi Jinping will act on his own schedule. There is a party congress scheduled for the fall in which his term will no doubt be extended, which will break the two-term limit that Deng Xiaoping set in motion these decades ago, and which the Chinese political structure has already set aside. So I don't think that he is going to do anything until after that point, but there is no question that he is looking at how NATO and the United States respond to this. And after that party congress, I think he will certainly take it into account in whether he will try to take back Taiwan by force.
I want to transition these audience questions because we've gotten a bunch on some news that happened yesterday of Russia taking control of Chernobyl. And so one of our readers wonders, do you think that Putin's motivation for seizing the nuclear power plant was, defensive to prevent Ukrainians from using it tactically, or offensive to increase Russia's nuclear arsenal, or something else?
It's a very interesting question. If you were going to be charitable, you might say it was seized to prevent fighting in that area, which could set off a nuclear reaction that would blow back, which could set off a disaster that would blow back into Russia. However, I have talked to Ukrainians this morning that fear Putin might use it as blackmail, threatening to release, and I don't know the technicalities of what still remains in the reactor core, but threatening to release whatever radiation still remains against Ukrainians. My guess is that he would be trying to prevent it from blowing back into Russia, because that would cost him personally. But, I don't know the full answer, except to say a real danger exists. Plus, Ukraine has I forget the number, it's in the low teens, maybe 13 other nuclear reactors. And there is worry amongst Ukrainians that one of them might be hit. And that could cause a disaster. So, yes, and I will just mention that Lukashenko, the dictator in Belarus, he has built a nuclear reactor on the model of Chernobyl, which is just as defective, apparently. And government officials in Lithuania are terrified that this thing will be put online because it has the same potential to end badly as did the first Chernobyl reactor. And it is right on the other side of the Belarus-Lithuanian border. And as I said, Belarus now basically belongs to Putin.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a couple questions here from readers who want to know about the Russian people. So a question from listener Maria Duga. Do the Russian people get any news from the outside world about what's happening in Ukraine? Are they only seeing sort of Russian propaganda TV, or do they have access to outside media?
It's astonishing the degree to which Russians still rely on television. It has always amazed me. It's easier to understand out in the broad heartland because, after all, Russia extends for 11 time zones. And it's harder to understand in Moscow, but it's also true, especially older people. So the news is totally full of propaganda. The Ukrainians are being presented as Nazis who want to kill Russian speakers. Ukraine is being presented as a bridgehead to be used by NATO to threaten Russia's very existence. And the propaganda is working. I mean, polls are showing that the percentage, and sorry, I don't have the statistics at my fingertip, but the percentage of Russians who dislike Ukraine has skyrocketed. More educated Russians who use the internet, who listen to news in the outside world, while it's still possible because Putin is trying to shut that off, like China has. They are aware, and that's why you saw this very brave demonstration yesterday by people knowing that they would probably be arrested and accused of being traitors.
So you actually set us up for the next audience question perfectly. So good job. A reader wants to know, what can U.S. citizens do to help Russians who were arrested for protesting yesterday?
I don't think there's anything we can do. I mean, after all, both this White House and if I remember correctly, actually maybe not the last White House, but this White House certainly has brought up the subject of Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who is languishing in a gulag prison. Putin is indifferent to pressure from outside on this. What I think can be done, and I think Americans have to think deeply, and I would hope that Republicans, at least in the Senate, would think differently about this and join with Democratic colleagues. The only way to help Ukrainians at this point is to get more defensive weapons into the country. And I am not sufficiently versed in ways this could be done. After all, the roads are blocked and the airports have been taken. But I have to believe it's not impossible. And what is needed is anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles. Some were sent before the war, but not enough, and not modern technology. This is the only thing I can think of that can be done. I say it as an opinion columnist because I have written it. And I also say it as an opinion columnist who has written that this is a turning point globally. If you have a leader of a country with the weapons that Putin possesses, who is willing to take over a country, you remember, and we do nothing, and the world does nothing. When Saddam Hussein took over the little country of Kuwait, the world rallied. Well, maybe it was the U.S. rallied, and the U.S. rallied its allies. Vladimir Putin is taking over a far bigger country, a democracy whose people do not want to be ruled by Vladimir Putin. And this is inevitably going to lead to much bigger problems for Europe and the United States. So people who want to know what they can do, I think, have to contact their Congress people and say, we have to help the Ukrainians resist.
That seems to be the answer a lot, is to contact your Congress people. But, folks can Google that. You can find that information really, really easily with a quick search. You touched on this in your last answer a bit, but I'm going to ask it again because a few different readers asked this question. Do you think it's possible at this point to get more weapons into Ukraine, given the presence of Russian troops in the country? Or is this sort of we're not sure if that's even a possibility?
I think it depends on how determined we are and whether we decide that this is a policy issue, which is essential to American national security and NATO national security. You've all seen World War II movies, where individuals and little packets of guns and explosives were dropped into the resistance in France. Well, this is 2022. So if we want to get more stuff in, I'm sure there are ways that it can be done. And the administration has said it would help the Ukrainian resistance. Well, the country hasn't fallen yet, although it may be on the verge. But I think the time to help the Ukrainian resistance is now, because, as I said, unless Vladimir Putin understands the cost, and sanctions only cost him in the long run, then, who knows which country he's going to try to take over next. And the moment is now.
Thank you. I'm going to return to a question that I almost asked earlier. Jeff Selig, this is your question. He wants to know, was it wise of President Biden to announce in advance and say over and over again that there would be no U.S. military involvement? Obviously, Ukraine is not a part of NATO, so we're not obligated to send troops. But should Biden have repeated that over and over again?
I think, this is a difficult question. NATO, the whole issue of NATO expansion to Ukraine is so complicated. In 2008, I believe it was, after Russia attacked the country of Georgia, or maybe before Russia attacked the country of Georgia. Forgive me if I'm getting my history garbled. But NATO had tentatively opened the door to membership by Georgia, a small country in the Caucasus region, which used to be a Soviet state, and Ukraine. Now the issue was, would we ever allow Ukraine to become a NATO member? This was a very delicate question because Putin does have nuclear weapons and made it clear that this was almost a casus belli to allow Ukraine into NATO. So the consensus is Ukraine's never going to get in. And I think Biden wanted to make clear to the American public that support for Ukraine and sanctions didn't mean we were sending troops to a new war, because we had no NATO obligation. I mean, after all the polls show this country doesn't want to get into another war, and this would be a war with Russia. Whether he should have kept repeating it, I don't know. What I do believe, I don't know if it would have made any difference. What I do believe is that more defensive weapons should have been sent. The Europeans were very reluctant. They wanted negotiations. But Putin has made clear that negotiations were just a cover story. And anyone who knew Putin should have known it then. I mean, Macron was fooled and was made to look like a fool because he kept thinking he could turn Putin around. Putin was determined. We could have been sending more. Instead, we were sending Stingers, which is the same weapons we were sending the Afghan Mujahideen in 1988 to fight the Soviets. It's too late to turn back the clock, but I certainly think that there must be a way to get more defensive weapons in if, as the White House pledged, we are going to help the Ukrainian resistance.
Thank you. So we're just at 1 hour now, but we have 2 more audience questions that I think are so important. We're going to go just for a few extra minutes to make sure we get to these. This one is from Michelle Smithman, who wants to know, did the departure of coalition forces from Afghanistan play any part in the timing of this invasion? Of course, folks remember the harrowing stories and photos that came out of Afghanistan less than a year ago. Seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't. How does that relate to what's happening now, Trudy?
I think that Putin was hatching his plan to take back Ukraine before the awful botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. However, I have to believe that what that withdrawal showed, it was not just the messiness of the withdrawal, it was the political weariness in this country with war and the political weariness amongst both parties. I mean, you have to remember that President Trump wanted to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, twice tried and was persuaded by the military not to, and signed a treaty with the Taliban that basically gave the country back to the Taliban, and not a treaty, an agreement. It set a date for withdrawal and conditions that basically were a handover to the Taliban. So Moscow and Putin saw that both parties sensed the country was and their base were weary of war. And of course, that played into his thinking that there is not going to be a military response to an aggression like this. Because the Americans don't want to send their boys out. And as I said in a previous reply, the Europeans were too divided, with Britain focused on Brexit, with Germany still determined, not to get involved in military conflict in any way, especially with Russia, and with France having a president that believed that he could go eyeball to eyeball and persuade Putin not to do it. So, yes, it factored. I don't think it was the determining factor, but it mattered.
Yeah. And then this is our last question. It's a one where we're asking you for a prediction, which of course we know is hard to make right now. But our last question is from viewer Robert Fisher, who wants to know, do you see any scenario where Russia will leave Ukrainian territory now that they've invaded?
It is hard to foresee one. I think the critical elements are the following. How brutal Russia is, especially in taking over the government. How determined Ukrainians are to move into a resistance. And how much this moves the world if, as I fear, Putin is willing to slaughter civilians, throw thousands in jail. And my prediction is that he'll send back a lot of Ukrainians who fled, who were in the pro-Russian government of Yanukovych, who was overthrown by a Ukrainian genuine uprising in 2014. And he wasn't overthrown, he fled. But they'll send back a lot of Ukrainian puppets, and they will send in a lot of Russia's own intelligence operatives to join the Ukrainian intelligence service and forge it into an anti-civic resistance mechanism. If the world sees this and sees a brave resistance, and sees the slaughter of civilians, which I fear, and does nothing, then yes, Russia will stay. If the world looks at this, and first of all, Russia is suspended from the Soviet Union, excuse me, they're acting like the Soviet Union. If Russia is suspended from the United Nations, perhaps even denied its veto at the Security Council. There's a precedent for suspension from activities in the UN, harder with the Security Council. If Putin is branded an international pariah, if all of the sanctions that haven't been activated yet are thrown at Moscow, and if the resistance is stiff, and if we get more weapons in there, and if the Russians start taking casualties because they don't really have an occupation army, maybe Putin would rethink. But I think this would be a long-term project. And if it's going to have any chance, I think we have to get those defensive weapons in now and start thinking about how to set up a Ukrainian government in exile if the Russians really come in and decapitate the current government, horrible word, and that government in exile should be given the seat at the United Nations, and the Russians should be branded, or Putin, not the Russians, that Putin should be branded an international outlaw, as Saddam Hussein was after annexing Kuwait.
Thank you, Trudy. It feels like we're living through history right now, which is something that sounds a bit cliche, but I think in this instance is more true than we can imagine. That is all the time we have this morning. Thank you, Trudy, for sharing your expertise with us. And thanks to everybody at home who watched and submitted questions. We had more than we could possibly get to. And thanks for hanging with us for an extra 10 minutes. I think it was worth it. For more from Trudy, visit us at inquirer.com/Trudy Rubin. And for more on what's happening in Ukraine, in Philadelphia, and everywhere in between, turn to inquirer.com. Thanks a lot.